and Community Development Committee. So I'd like to call this a meeting to order. And I think everyone has figures out what to do. It's a little noisy now since I'm in the office, but I may get a little discombobulated. But in the sense of reminding everyone, as we know, to use your mute button while you're not speaking. So just so we can hear as much as possible. And then just a statement that is permitted by the governor, disaster declaration of November 13th, 2020. The determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee to meet at this time. So we are having, and to ensure a transparent and open meeting as possible, we will be posting the meeting minutes approximately 1 week in advance, and you should have all seen that too. And we'll providing a recording of the meeting that will be linked. So is the recording started, Enrique? Yes. Okay, great.
We are live.
So then we will move on. And I guess just I have a question. I had heard that the governor is going to now, as of July, allow meetings and possibly allow meetings in person. Do we know if this meeting after this one might be in person, or if you had any plans for that?
So I'll hop in here, Sherry. Hi everyone, Erin Alaman, Executive Director. We are targeting a September board meeting in person. We actually have our board and policy committee meetings tomorrow and on Thursday this week. And so I think one of the things we'll do over the next month or two is reach out to committee members and understand their comfort level. I think one of the challenges will be is if folks want to continue to have virtual as an option. It's challenging to make sure that the agenda and opportunity for comment and participation and to have people both in the office and online. So we'll talk that through with a number of you, but maybe there's some sort of set schedule we can start with. So we're focusing on getting our board and policy committee in person first, and then I think after that follow the committees, applying for committees.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds like what schools have been going through. So hopefully we'll be able to manage maybe a little bit better than they have and stuff, but great. Thank you so much. So now we are working towards any agenda changes or announcements. Enrique, were there any?
There are currently no agenda changes or announcements. There's no agenda changes, but there is one announcement that we would like to make is that CMAP staff Beatrix Yan will be interim helping out with our HCD committee as we figure out filling the position that Timmy has left vacant.
Great. Well, welcome, Beatrix. Do you want to say anything about your involvement, what you're doing, what you do at CMAP?
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm Beatrix. I'm an assistant planner at CMAP, and I'll just be assisting in taking the meeting notes and creating the meeting minutes for this meeting. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate that. Okay, so next is, and the notes say also too that the meeting is being recorded, and then there is the chat box if we have any questions on that. Okay, next would be the approval of our last meeting minutes, which was April 13th. Do I have a motion to approve?
Jackie Forbes, so moved.
Great, thank you. And second, anyone? That looks like Lori Dittman. Okay, and all in. So now we're going to get for people to, let's see, I'm going to read your name and you'll say whether you approve the minutes and if you are present. So let's see if I can go through this, and I apologize for any mistakes I make in any pronunciation or in general, any mistakes I make, I guess. So Alicia Button, are you here? Okay. Fluturi Demirovsky?
Here, I approve the minutes.
Thank you. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you? Good. To see everybody.
And Lori Dittman?
Here and yes.
Great. Jackie Forbes?
Present and yes.
Great. Hi, nice to see you. Joan Fox? Kendra Freeman? Melody Geraci?
Present and yes.
Great. Hi, Melody. Jackie Grimshaw. Hannah Kite. Oh, and I see Joan, you're here. Thank you.
Thanks. I
Hannah?
had trouble unmuting.
Oh, no problem. I know, I thought I saw you. Hannah, Gretchen Knowlton.
Present and approve.
Hi, Gretchen.
Hi.
Tiffany McDowell. Greg Pullman.
Present and yay.
Great, thank you, Greg. Obaye Reed. Enrique Salgado. Raj Shah.
Present and approve.
Hi, Raj. Rosalie Shemmer. Darnell Shields. Jana Simon. Dominic Tochi. And William Towns. So I guess we didn't get any not approved. So I think our minutes pass, if that's correct, Enrique.
Yep.
Okay, great. So as you know, we've been having, and we really do appreciate having our committee members report. Although Fluturi was going to report. Did you join, Fluturi?
Yes, I am here. Yes.
Okay.
I'm Sherry.
Sorry. Yes.
We have the CMAP board meeting update first.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
It's okay.
So we will we'll move to that. We'll actually move to the CMAP board meeting updates for Aaron.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Our board meeting actually meets tomorrow, as well as our coordinating committee, and MPO meets on Thursday. But first, before I give a few updates here, I wanted to introduce our new Deputy Executive Director for our Research Analysis and Planning team. And his name is Yusuf Salama. He's on the line here. His position is filling a vacancy that Jesse Elam left when he went to Cook County. So Yusuf has a strong transportation history, and maybe I'll just ask him to say hello to you all and introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and good morning, everyone. My name is Yusuf Salama. I've just recently joined CMAP on June the 4th. And as Aaron mentioned, I've spent about 11 years of my professional career in infrastructure planning, financing, procurement, and contract negotiation on both sides of the North American border between Canada and the United States. I've worked at both the federal, state, county, and local levels, delivering infrastructure that includes transportation, public transit, water and wastewater infrastructure, as well as solid waste management infrastructure. So it's a great pleasure to join CMAP, and I look forward to working with all of you and building relationships. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, Aaron.
Well, thanks. We're excited to have him here. And also, so this committee is really focused on people who work with people across our region. And I think that's one of the most important things that we continue to keep in mind as we do long range planning, whether it's for transportation, water, but that at the end of the day, it's about the people who live here and making sure that we are inclusive and that there's opportunity for everyone to be successful. Because oftentimes we think about infrastructure, but we aren't necessarily talking about people. So we've been trying to do a lot more of reframing the way that we talk about the work that we do here. And this committee is really influential in that. So just wanted to cover a couple of other things. Since December, I've been trying to attend as many of these meetings as possible. And as I mentioned earlier when Sherry asked, we've been thinking about when to get our committees back in person meetings. So we'll continue to work with the committee liaisons and talk a little bit about what makes sense in terms of agenda, in-person meetings. There are some benefits, I know, to making sure that people from across the region can participate to these virtual forums that we've been having. But we have a new director of strategic alignment and innovation. Her name is Allison Case, and her role here at CMAP is to help us think about how we make sure that the connections are strong between our working committees and our board and our policy committee as well. So you'll be seeing her as well in some of our meetings moving forward. So I wanted to just mention that as well. We started allowing staff back in the office last month and this month on Wednesdays and Thursdays on a voluntary basis, and we imagine we will continue to do so until the fall. So our target date is to get staff back in the office on a rotating basis more formally after September 7th here. We still are continuing to require masks in the office, as is the building. But, I know that on this Friday, the state and the city will have additional guidance on the reopening or getting to phase 5. So again, we continue to sort of monitor what's going on and making sure that that we're staying abreast of the important CDC and health guidelines that are out there. So our plans right now are just to continue to focus on that September date, regardless of what gets reopened, what the guidelines are for this summer. But we do have some staff coming into the office as it makes sense here. Also just wanted to note, so we'll be talking a little bit more about our State of the Region events and our Regional Excellence Awards. You may have seen this in our weekly email here. But we are planning our first ever State of the Region event on October 7th to coincide with the anniversary of On to 2050. So the goal will be to share progress on the plans implementation activities, to celebrate the successes, and to move our stakeholders towards a common regional vision here. So as part of that process, we will be hosting an awards ceremony as a way to recognize and celebrate successes of others. And so the categories for the awards program will include visionary awards, as well as recognition of projects and that support the plan's principles of inclusive growth, resiliency, and prioritized investment. So please mark your calendars for October 7th to join us. We'd love to have you there. Again, more details will be forthcoming here. But the last thing I'll just mention too, at tomorrow's board meeting, the board will be getting a preview or a sort of, I'll say, a refresher, sort of 101 presentation on freight across our region and rail infrastructure across our region. One of the things that's been in the news lately is the Canadian National proposed acquisition of the Kansas City Southern Line. And then Canadian Pacific also has a bid in for it too. So 6 of the 7 Class 1 railroads in our region come through our region, and they're important to our economy. They're important to the goods movement across our region and across our nation here. And so with some of this proposed purchases, as we've seen before, they have some impacts on communities, on the crossing delays that we see in the region, but they also have some impacts on the pricing of the goods movement that we need to circulate through our region and across the country. So there were some concerns at the last board meeting that were raised, so we wanted to sort of just bring this back as a point of information for our board members to talk about the critical role that freight plays in our region, and see if we can get some data to begin to do some analysis internally, if possible, on the proposed impacts, or anticipated impacts should that purchase go through. So those are my highlights for the board meeting that you'll see tomorrow, but I'm happy to answer any other questions, but always appreciate the time and your participation.
Okay, it doesn't seem like we have. Thank you, Erin. Whether there are any questions, and welcome Yusuf and all the new people coming to CMAP. It's an exciting time, I think, to be there and to moving this work forward. I do see that a few people have joined, and thank you for putting your names in the chat. But if you just want to just introduce, so Alicia, I see that you're here, and we had Joan before. And Futuri, you're going to be presenting next, so we will know that you are here. If anyone else that we didn't get a chance to say that you're here, if you just want to unmute and let us know, it'd be great. And if not, we will move to your presentation. Futuri, I'm sorry, I keep on, so appreciate, I'm sorry for any mispronunciation of your name, she'll be talking about the RTA and her work there, and sort of the goals of really relating to the goals of On to 2050 and to our HCD committee. So Futuri, excuse me, Futuri, please share with us. Thank you.
So I'm Fluturi Demirovsky. I am a senior analyst here at the Regional Transportation Authority, and I manage the Section 5310
I think you're
program.
are you on mute still? I can't hear you yet.
No, I have my microphone on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the projects that the RTA is working on. So in March, the RTA allocated approximately $486.2 million of the federal aid funding for the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Apportionments Act of 2021, the CRISA funding. So the service works to sustain critical transit services across the region based on the RTA's analysis of who is most likely to use transit in general, who is most likely to need transit from an equity perspective, and what industries will likely need people to work in person. The information was made available for public comment and is available online for those interested on RTA's website. Also, the RTA awarded Phase 1 engineering funding at 100% to 4 high-need communities as part of last year's Access to Transit call for projects. Funding that was only available to high and very high-need communities. Those communities included the Village of Berkeley, the City of Harvard, Village of Sauk Village, and the Village of University Park. We also continue to manage the Section 5310 program for the region, which provides funding for transportation projects that serve people with disabilities and seniors. We are currently ramping up our most recent call for projects, and we are opening the public comment period for the proposed projects in July. So it's going to run July 1st through the 30th for the 30-day public comment period. RTA staff recently completed a study in partnership with PACE that sought to identify potential innovations within ADA paratransit operations that PACE could pilot in the near term to improve the customer experience as well as the financial sustainability of the program. Excuse me. Recommended pilots were presented to the RTA board in May and currently are under consideration by PACE. We also continue to operate the ADA Paratransit Certification Program, a civil right for people with disabilities, and also continue to operate the Reduced Fare Program, a federally mandated program with people with disabilities and seniors. So other topics that we're working on, the RTA has been undertaking a 3-step COVID recovery strategy that started with step 1 of adopting a budget last year that acknowledged the current realities, continued in step 2 with executing on the budget and allocating federal funding to sustain critical transit in 2021. And we'll continue with step 3 of recovery, which will involve a long-term strategic plan to look out to 2023 and beyond that will start over the summer. And between November and January, RTA conducted a COVID-19 lapsed rider survey to better understand the travel behavior, attitudes, and performances of current and lapsed transit riders of the Chicagoland during the COVID-19 pandemic. The survey provided insight that the RTA and service boards will use to better understand shifting rider markets. So that concludes my presentation. If anyone has any questions.
This is Lori. Is there any top line or quick summary you could give of the lapsed rider survey? What were the findings?
I could get that information to you. I did not work on that project. Another staff person in our agency did, but I can certainly get that information over to you through Enrique.
Yeah,
Curious about that. Thank
Okay.
if you send that information to me, I can include it in the minutes with a link as well to the survey.
Yes, certainly. We'll do that.
Thanks.
Yeah, that would be great. Really, I think important to learn what's going on and then how people are responding to that. So,
Okay, wonderful. I'll get that over to you today or tomorrow.
great. Is there any other questions? So thank you so much for presenting and also thank you for being a ongoing member of the committee. I think we really appreciate your approach and knowledge as we go along on including everything. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, everyone.
So next we have a presentation by Matt Stern as a program project manager and also with Austin Edwards on local, as you can see here, improving local development incentives. And definitely will be something for me to think about too, as it talks about, as it mentioned in our agenda, just the how different communities allocate their funding for economic development and the different incentives that they might be using. So Matt, you can take it away.
Thanks, Sherry. I appreciate that introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Stern. I'm a policy analyst here at CMAP, and I'm here with Austin Edwards, my colleague, and we'll be talking today about this project that we've been working on for the last 2 years or so and are still working on as well. We have plenty to cover, some of which represents projects that have been recently completed, others represent projects that are ongoing. I'm really interested in this group's feedback and response. Please feel free to pipe up at any point in the chat box or just by unmuting yourself and ask questions as we go. We also have a couple of discussion questions at the end of the slide deck. Next slide, please, Enrique. So this work comes directly out of On to 2050, which calls for incentive reform via a couple of different recommendations, including calling for stronger standards for transparency and accountability for incentive use, as well as better alignment of incentives with local and regional goals, outcomes, and trade-offs. And so with On to 2050 calling for us to do this work, including specifically asking CMAP to provide best practices and models to help local governments in the region refine and improve their incentive use, we've been on this project to attempt to fulfill that portion of the plan. Next slide, please. So from On to 2050, the first thing that we tackled in 2019 and 2020 was drafting a guide for local governments called Improving Local Development Incentives. And so we released that last fall, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about our findings from that and some of the nuances of our research into best practices there. Building on this work, we're doing a handful of other things. Austin is taking the lead on developing a report on the prevalence of incentive use in the region, and we'll be talking about that later today. We're also working through our local technical assistance program to start a consortium of local communities to talk about incentive best practices and increase opportunities for neighbor-to-neighbor partnership on economic development issues, as well as some direct support to some communities who are interested in tackling these really difficult conversations. Next slide. So the incentives guide was the first step in this ladder, and I'll spend the next handful of slides talking about some of our findings from that. But really the purpose of this product was to create a desktop resource for community groups, for municipalities, economic developers, community developers around the region who work on these issues all the time. And our hope is to provide a series of implementable practices that are accessible to them that may increase the effectiveness of incentive use over time. Next slide, please. The core challenge here that we really focused on in developing the guide and is really the centerpiece of our conversations with municipalities on this topic is this tension between what incentives look like from the local angle versus from a wider, longer term, more regional angle. Locally, incentives are often incredibly rational economic and community development tools. All communities face really steep competition with their neighbors. Revenue disbursement formulas often reward that competition, especially over sales tax generating businesses, and then particularly in disinvested communities that struggle with slow growth, high property tax burdens, limited staff capacity. Incentives are often one of the only accessible tools to achieve community and economic development in the short term. The story looks different when you zoom out to a wider angle. There's a substantial universe of academic researchers who who study incentive use and their effects. And for the most part, they are agreed that incentives are fairly inefficient tools. For example, some studies indicate that the substantial majority of incentives don't actually sway business location decisions. One reason for this is, information asymmetry just between a business recruiting or seeking an incentive for a new location and for an expansion and the local government that they're in conversation with. There's also a concern about costs and the indirect costs that taxing districts bear when they successfully recruit incentivized development. Sometimes those costs can be higher than the tax revenues that business ends up bringing in, especially when those revenues are decreased artificially due to an incentive the company has received. And then perhaps most substantially concerning over the long term, and we've seen this over the last few decades nationally, that as incentives become increasingly the norm, the competition for businesses using incentives drives revenues down for levels of government that give incentives, whether or not they succeed at winning the business through an incentive negotiation process. As incentives get larger and larger, the public sector sees fewer revenues and the private sector sees more savings. And so essentially this underlying tension here is that there are substantial structural challenges that encourage incentive use, especially in deeply disinvested communities. But that incentive use over time can reinforce those structural challenges and make them harder to solve. And so addressing this is core to our work on this topic. Next slide. I want to mention that there have been a handful of important journalism pieces over the last 6 to 8 months here in the region. These two that I have on screen right now are focused more specifically on Amazon. Amazon is certainly not the only player here, although they are certainly a large one. And these articles, and I can share links if anyone is interested if you haven't seen them, as well as a substantial amount of other journalism that's been done recently, really highlights these challenges, both that communities feel like incentives are a deeply fundamental and necessary part of their community and economic development, but at the same time that those incentives can create fiscal challenges for communities over the long run. Next slide. So the incentives guide focuses on trying to create a 10,000-foot understanding of the context of local development incentives, what we're talking about, what specific types of incentives we're referring to, a little bit about their prevalence, a summary of some of the limitations that I've been talking about today. And then it really focuses on opportunities to make incentive use as effective as possible within the given economic landscape. And so these are broken up into a series of strategies that contain a wide variety of very specific practices underneath them, as well as some overarching principles. And what I'll do at the end of this presentation is I'll drop a link in the chat to the guide itself if you haven't seen it already. But I'm going to spend the next few slides highlighting just a few of the recommendations that we make. Next slide, please. This is an example of one of the strategies, this idea that incentives should be used as much as possible to promote high quality employment. And so under this heading, we identify a number of practices that communities could implement to attempt to do this more. These include some fairly standard things, standard practices, such as including job quality and job quantity requirements and incentive deals, using incentive negotiations to promote first source hiring. This is arrangements where communities look first to the local community to fill open positions before looking beyond the borders of the community. Doing what a municipality can do to facilitate connections to training programs and using incentives to provide workforce development resources wherever possible so that the benefits of the incentive really stay with community members and workers who are receiving workforce development training. In some sort of best practices, these may be further reaches for many communities, especially lower capacity ones. Things like mandating companies set up career pathways, using incentives to fund job training programs, structuring incentives in a way that businesses are financially rewarded for hiring local, creating incentive structures that support or require better accommodations for workers and customers with disabilities, and then creating reward structures or requirement structures for local business-to-business purchasing so that there's a multiplier effect of the benefit of the incentive. And so this is an example of there are a number of these pages in the guide with high quality employment just being one. And the next slide highlights just a handful of other ones from the guide briefly. Can we get the next slide, Enrique? Thanks. Things like establishing goals and conditions publicly, using incentives to develop community benefits and advancing racial and economic equity, targeting projects with the greatest potential for impact, and then considering wherever possible non-financial solutions to the challenges that a business faces rather than filling their need with a financial incentive. And then on the right-hand side here are just selections of one practice from each of these four strategies. And again, the guide contains a number of others under each of these buckets. Next slide. All of these strategies fit into four principles that we identify: that incentive use should be performance-driven, that incentive use should be transparent. This transparency has multiple benefits, both for taxpayers to understand how their taxing districts are prioritizing and utilizing taxpayer funds, but also for businesses that may be seeking incentives, because transparency and incentive programs can help a business understand exactly what is available to them and what they need to do to qualify for it. That incentives should pursue equity. This is certainly complicated and hard to do, and it's a conversation that is being had nationally right now in many communities about how to improve the equity of incentive use. And finally, in case you were concerned, this was not a CMAP project, that incentives should be used wherever possible to pursue regional growth rather than specific local fiscal benefit. And so that sort of summarizes the guide. Next slide, please. It's available at this short link. I'll drop it in the chat as well. We're really interested in getting this guide out there. It has been more complicated than usual because of the pandemic and a lack of in-person meetings to distribute this widely amongst municipal partners and other taxing district partners. So we certainly appreciate the committee's help with that. We're also not done with this work, even though the guide is published, and I think Austin's portion of this presentation will reflect that. And so we're always interested in feedback about our perspective on this and ways that we can continue to do better and encourage the region to approach incentives in the most effective way possible. And so unless there are any burning questions or comments now, I'll hand it over to Austin, and then we can have some discussion questions at the end as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Matt. I don't see anything coming through the chat, so I think I'll move on to my piece of this little narrative. As Matt was saying, incentives can be a tool for achieving any number of public goals, and like any tool, once in a while you need to do inventory and make sure that it remains fit for purpose. So today I'll be providing some initial findings on 3 common types of incentive tools: sales tax rebates, tax increment financing, and Cook County property tax incentive classes. This is part of a report that we're putting together on the overall prevalence, the scale and scope of incentive use here in the region. In that report, we will also be looking at property tax abatements and business districts, but for the interest of time today, I think we're just going to skirt around those pieces. We know that over 2/3 of, next slide, please. We know that over 2/3 of the municipalities in our 7-county region are currently implementing at least one of these incentive programs. Altogether, incentives cost local governments hundreds of millions of dollars. due to how they are reported and the availability of high quality data, it's difficult to sum up incentive use into a single cost figure, but we know that the numbers are big, and evaluating their efficacy and trying to find ways to improve them in alignment with research is critical. And so what we are going to do what we do best and try to bring some more systematic data to the problem. Next slide, please. So as we are continuing to develop this prevalence report, there are a number of objectives that we want to think through. As we think of our role as CMAP, there are several things that we can offer. One is analysis, much like the guide that we just put together on standard and best practices, looking at both the experience of local communities and academic research. There's the convening power that we have to bring communities together to talk about best practices, to think about some of the more structural reforms that we can put in place to reduce the need for incentives. And then there's data and trying to put some more systematic data and context around the use of incentives, which is something we've really seen missing from the conversation so far. So as we think about how we can bring our capacity to bear on these issues, we want to think about how we can provide that data, support the uptake of the guide, engage officials in some of those more structural issues and reforms, and then frame incentives relative to other strategies and investment decisions that we might make to ensure growth. Next slide, please. Municipalities and counties can share a portion of their sales tax revenue generated in a development back to individual businesses. This is what we call sales tax rebate. This can include both their local option sales tax and the portion of state sales tax that is dispersed to local governments. Our analysis of a database from the Illinois Department of Revenue shows 328 active sales tax rebate agreements in 123 municipalities. This is down slightly from 2015, when we found 359 active agreements among 132 governments. Some rebates are simply a percent of any sales tax revenue collected, but local governments may use other provisions to help limit the potential cost of offering these subsidies. Agreements may define the number of years that it is in effect, a minimum sales threshold, or requirements on occupancy or certified lease space, or they can define the maximum amount that can be returned. As I said earlier, the availability of high quality data is pretty limited, and we don't have complete information. But for the published maximums on these rebates, we know that the total could come to $447 million over the lifespan of these agreements. But the total cost of rebates in the region could well exceed that, in particular because we don't have complete information. And so it's really kind of anyone's guess as to how much these rebates are costing us. Sales tax rebates can obligate a significant amount of funding over time if they don't have caps in place. 10 communities have maximum rebates of more than $10 million, and 36 others have agreements that will last for more than 20 years, but have no reported maximum rebate. So it really is, like I said, an open question as to how much this is costing the region. And how are we utilizing these tools? Well, over half of sales tax rebate agreements are related to retail categories, with more than a third going to vehicle dealerships. In 2012, the General Assembly passed legislation requiring local governments to report their sales tax rebate agreements to the Department of Revenue, but that database is inconsistent and very incomplete. For example, we only have key information like maximums of a particular revenue source for about half the agreements. Next slide, please. Municipalities with few revenue options often use sales tax rebates to spur development that has more of a local fiscal benefit than meaningful economic effect. This gets to many of the issues that Matt was just talking about, and that tension between regional benefit and local needs. The state's current tax systems contributes to this type of sales tax driven development. Sales tax revenue typically composes 10 percentage points more of total municipal revenues for communities with active sales tax rebate agreements. We're still diving into some of these trends, trying to pick them apart and really be able to explain them really succinctly to make sure we have our arms around what these trends mean. But there is a pretty clear pattern between the types of communities that are using sales tax rebates and those that are not. Next slide, please. I also want to talk about Cook County incentive classes. Cook County, as many of you will know, assesses commercial and industrial property at a higher rate than residential property. So for businesses, they are assessed with 25% market value. For residential property, that's 10% of market value. This results in a higher tax burden on many businesses and can be an impediment to economic development. Incentive classes reduce the assessment rate for certain commercial and industrial property owners for up to 12 years, although some are renewable and they can be sent for quite a bit longer. 95 municipalities in the county, as well as some portions of unincorporated Cook County, use incentive classes. This composes about 9% of the estimated commercial and industrial market value, so a pretty healthy chunk of the property tax base here in Cook County. The ongoing popularity is an indication of the ways that classification becomes a barrier to economic development and how it constrains local revenue options while creating barriers to reinvestment in Cook County. If you have been with us for very long, you know that ultimately CMAP is a firm champion of more structural solutions like the gradual phasing out of Cook County's classification system, which can help to address some of these inequities. In particular, because we have found in the past that over half of the tax burden on commercial industrial taxpayers is a function of the burden shift that is inherent to the classification system. Next slide, please. As we think about the patterns in Cook County incentive classes, there's not surprising trends, but we need to sort of pick them apart a little bit. Distribution is driven by two main factors: the presence of significant industrial lands like those in communities around O'Hare or across the south suburbs, as well as the statutory restrictions on Class 8 revitalization incentives to enterprise zones or particular townships across Southern Cook. So as we think about the heavy use of incentive of these incentive classes across the south and west suburbs, those are both sort of purposely targeted to those areas and also reflective of the land use trends in those areas. Industrial developments in particular make up about 2/3 of the total market value in the incentive classes, and communities with significant industrial lands like McCook, Bedford Park, or Northlake incentivize nearly all of their industrial properties. Among the 21 municipalities where industrial property makes up at least 5% of the total market value, so the 21 municipalities are sort of most industrialized, if you want to think of it that way. Of those 21 municipalities, 16 have placed 90% or more in incentive classes. By comparison, no municipality incentivizes more than half their commercial market value. So as we continue to think about the use of incentive classes to protect the secure industrial lands or to address the revitalization of former industrial parks, there's a pretty clear trend as to where those land uses exist and where incentive classes are being used. Next slide, please. I also want to touch on the tax increment financing. Generally, our committees are a little bit more informed or familiar with TIFs than our other audiences, but just as a quick recap for those who may not be as familiar, TIFs are used to fund improvements in blighted areas or to conserve areas that may become blighted. They effectively freeze the property tax base of various taxing authorities and use any excess tax collections to finance redevelopment projects. So as you look at this bottom dark green bar across the bottom, they sort of, like I said, freeze the property tax base, and then they use that sort of light green color, that wedge of tax revenue collections to fund redevelopment projects. TIFs can divert revenues from a wide area to the benefit of specific developments that would otherwise go toward general services and infrastructure. And there's a lot of debate around the use of TIFs, both nationwide and also here in the region. Next slide, please. Altogether, about 6% of the region's property tax base is committed to raising TIF revenues. There are 181 municipalities, roughly about 2/3 of those in the region, with active TIF districts, and they're bringing in about $1.4 billion a year in total revenues. Unfortunately, we don't have a clear data source sort of compiled in one place around TIF expenditures in particular, but we know that there's a large amount of money flowing into the TIF system as a whole. And I should point out here that this totals do not include the red purple modernization here in the city of Chicago, which is really sort of a different beast around using value capture to fund transit improvements. Next slide, please. There has been about $14 billion collected through TIFs over the last 18 years once you adjust for inflation, with the annual totals tripling. 35, there's a sort of a mixture of reasons that contribute to this. 35 more communities have established districts or have expanded the ones they already had in place. Some properties in TIF districts have also appreciated in value, and some local governments may have raised property tax rates to cover costs. It's really quite difficult to sort of tease apart what's the main driving force behind this growth in TIF revenues over the last 20 years. But we know that regional trends are driven in part by the city of Chicago, which now makes up around 2/3 of annual TIF extensions. This includes downtown districts in the Loop that have accounted for substantial shares of regional TIF totals. But revenues for suburban Cook and the Collier counties have nonetheless increased by about 155% over the same time period. So the growth in TIF revenue is really sort of a region-wide narrative, and we are trying to tease those apart a little bit to understand what's really driving it at the regional level. Next slide, please. So now that I've sort of given sort of the top line summary statistics around each of these incentive programs, I want to talk about where we're going next. We are going to be pushing forward and thinking about how the larger narrative around incentive use can be drawn out of the data. We can sort of provide as many bullet points as possible, but it doesn't necessarily help inform the conversations around more structural reforms. And so how can we elevate some of those narratives out of the data? And this is particularly thinking about how well incentives are being used to target priority areas outlined in Option 2050. And this can take a lot of different forms. We know that there are some pretty clear trends around municipalities that use incentives and those that do not. On average, municipalities with active incentives have more people living in economically disconnected areas. They have lower median household incomes and a smaller potential tax base when we think in terms of property values or annual retail sales. But they also rely more heavily on property taxes for operating and capital funds. These differences reflect both the distinct barriers to market investment in higher need communities and policies intended to prioritize or restrict incentive use to such areas. And so we want to be thinking about how we can look across municipalities and think about larger trends in the incentive use. So next slide, please. As I said, one way we want to think about this is sort of how well are incentives being targeted to areas of need. So here, many of you will recognize a layer that we discussed at length during the ON 2050 development process. This includes both economically disconnected areas and disinvested areas, so sort of the commercial industrial versus industrial sides of disadvantage. And we want to think about how can we look at the use of incentives sort of across programs and across types in these different areas. We know that local economic developers often use incentive programs interchangeably, so they might use a property tax abatement for one development and then use a Cook County class incentive for another one, or they might combine some of them, including both property tax abatement and a sales tax rebate. So how can we standardize across those different incentive types and provide sort of a rough estimate of the total use of incentives in different target areas, and then try to, like I said earlier, bring out some of those larger narratives that could help inform the conversation around structural reforms. Next slide. So with that, I think we'll bring Matt back and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have or to lead a brief discussion around the discussion topics we have here.
Thanks, Austin. We put together the handful of questions you see on the slide now. We'd be happy to take any questions about this work or comments or go down any rabbit hole that anyone on the committee is interested in going down. I'm not seeing anyone jump on the mute button or jump on the microphone button, I should say. So I will say that some of the things that we were interested in talking about today were how we can most effectively support disinvested communities around these best practices, given the structural challenges that both Austin and I talked about today. What messages we need to center in drafting this upcoming prevalence report to keep the focus on these structural issues that drive incentive need, as well as whether there are any research questions about incentive use in the region that you have to cross-reference those with the data that we've been pulling together, which, as Austin said, is slimmer than we would like it to be, but would certainly be interested in any questions that you all have for this data set.
I just have a practical question. Are any of those maps that you showed available in an interactive format online so that we could see what communities, see an overlay, of the communities and towns?
Not yet. The last map that we looked at, the economically disconnected and disinvested areas, that's a local strategy map through the 2050 plan. And as you may have seen in our promotion of the plan, there are a number of interactive maps that also provide some case studies, some little brief narratives that help to characterize these maps a little bit better. We are committed to trying to make the data we've collected public and to try to think about how we can make that accessible online so that more people in local communities or in the media who have their own research questions can sort of take it on and do their own analysis with it. We haven't quite figured out what that looks like yet, but it is one of our goals for the project.
Could you help define or explain the difference between disconnected and disinvested communities?
Good question. So they were developed separately, but sort of in conjunction with each other during the plan development process. Economically disconnected areas focus more heavily on household income, the rate of English proficiency among households, and other sort of markers of people-centered disadvantage or disconnection from the economy. That is in contrast to disinvested areas that look more at market values and, I believe, small business lending to get more on sort of the commercial, industrial, the business side of areas that are experiencing disinvestment.
Thank you.
Happy to answer.
This is Raj. I just wanted to go to your question, the first one about how CMAP can effectively support disinvested communities on incentives-based practices. I guess the message is, and it's hard, right, with the data that you have and what you've shared, because you can show some of the transfers that are happening to the business entities that are getting benefits from this, but we're not always showing what the downstream impact is on the community itself, apart from potentially sales tax revenues decreased. It's going to the hands of these private groups that might not be in the community, might be being pulled out of the community. And the community has a lower tax base to provide for all the other services. So they're constantly being told that, we don't have enough funds in our accounts to manage, the needs for the general population. But in the end, isn't it that the disinvested communities are sometimes being used by politicians, by the companies that are requesting for these incentives to say that, hey, this is something that's going to help these communities get better and to improve. But is that a false message, right? Is it truly a false message? You cannot use a disinvested community to prove your case if there is nothing that's coming back to the community to move them out of a disinvested community.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really insightful way of framing it, and you're absolutely right. That interplay between businesses and local disinvested communities is one that is especially fraught. And those articles, especially the Better Government Association WBEZ article that I mentioned earlier, really focuses on that and exploring the dynamic that you're talking about. I think one of the particularly hard things with disinvested communities is that their staff and elected leadership often see incentives, rightfully so in many situations, as one of the only tools that they have available to them to get development within a landscape that is already rife with high taxes and limited resources. And so it's a little bit of a sort of self-reinforcing conundrum. But I really appreciate your comments. And I will say one other thing to the tax revenue question that you raised at the beginning. One of the things that we're hoping to do with the prevalence report is explain very clearly fiscal impacts of each of these incentive tools because they're often slightly more complex than is often perceived. With many of these incentive tools, because the tax base is being decreased by the incentive, the municipality, what ends up happening is not a decrease in revenues for the municipality, but an increase in tax rates for the taxpayers in that taxing district because there's a smaller base over which the same size levy must be spread. And so the burden of incentives is often felt quite directly by other unincentivized taxpayers in a community.
Something I'll just add briefly is that I think one of the points you're getting to is our ability to sort of across the board evaluate incentive use here and its outcomes for communities. And unfortunately, that's very difficult to do on an individual basis because of sort of the challenges of characterizing the counterfactual, what would have happened if we had not offered this incentive. And then when you sort of bring that up to the regional level, that becomes even more challenging given the data access and quality issues. But I think that's part of the message that's sort of baked into our next question, which is how do we keep the focus at the structural issues, the structural reforms that would reduce the need for incentives? Because even in disinvested areas, there are plenty of anecdotes in which incentives have been used effectively to secure one or two developments, but they haven't necessarily addressed the underlying structural barriers to these communities. And so how do we think about the tax system, the revenue options for local governments, the other larger narratives that we need to be looking at and keeping an eye on as we talk about incentives use specifically?
Yeah, and it may not necessarily be the counterfactual, right? Like if we didn't put these incentives, what would have happened to these communities? But we did put these incentives in the communities, and what has happened after 10 years? Has it moved from a disinvested community to now a fully invested community? Absolutely not. We know that story, right? And then we keep the doubling down and telling these same communities that, oh, we'll put another TIF in your community to get more money, and it doesn't work, right? It's just more money coming out. I mean, I guess number 3 on the research question is with the data you have, knowing who they've signed agreements with, okay? How many of them are not locally based? I mean, how many of them are outside of those communities? So the money is actually flowing out to those businesses, right? Some of it, okay, they hire a few people, they get it, but are they really hiring from the community? I doubt it.
Yeah, certainly continuing to figure out how to explore those sorts of outcomes is something that we're interested in doing in this work if we can manage it, and definitely in future research as well. And the employment point is a good one, and again, difficult due to data availability. And maybe one outcome here is continuing to advocate for data reporting structures that taxing districts are sort of obligated to feed into, so that the kinds of questions that you're asking can be, more holistically answered.
Yeah, and we've seen that a little bit, even though it's imperfect, like in the health systems where I exist, right? To maintain your not-for-profit status, the state attorneys general requires you to send a report essentially showing that you're providing charitable care and at some level. And of course, those systems can be gamed, and I get it. But at least there's some accountability that every year leadership has to provide a report that is, publicly available and can be scrutinized by places like the Better Government Group or CMAP or private entities, right? To say, are you really telling the truth and hold people accountable?
I agree with that, Raj, in the sense of really measuring, has this had any impact, and thinking about one of the components and principles of transparency, making sure that the community knows if it has been successful, if they are following as much as possible as you have data for, they can provide data of local hiring and other investments into the communities. I had just a quick question. I know we were on time, but in the sense of promoting more of the regional incentive as opposed to more local incentive, and how do you do that to encourage regions to work together to help support, especially the disinvested communities?
Well, that is a question that gets to the heart of CMAP's work around the regional economy. And I think there's a number of ways that we can do that. One is by providing things like the guide that can help sort of improve practices from the bottom up. Another would be a project that we've long had in mind around trying to look at the state incentive programs and how the state's role might be providing a little bit more leadership on where the state and local governments are putting their time and money. And it's also about providing other strategies, other information that sort of puts incentive use into context around other strategies. So where are, say, transportation investments or land use decisions or taxing decisions that put a little bit more, like I said earlier, the structural elements in place to allow for stronger growth? And how do we put that in context relative to the more limited outcomes of incentives use? We would love to see more local communities work together on a sort of sub-regional level to think about how 2, 3, 5 communities could sort of form their own approach in conjunction with one another. And then also working with the counties to think about where can the counties be providing leadership for their municipalities. There's a number of different legs that we can sort of lean on to sort of make that argument, but it's one that we're constantly sort of keeping an eye on as we think through future projects.
Maybe the embedded planner program, I don't know if they do help to try to establish those relationships or continue those relationships among municipalities.
Well, the incentives consortium that I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that is just in its very nascent stages right now will certainly seek to do many of the things that you're talking about, Sherry.
That'd be great. So this was extremely detailed and a lot of information. I look forward to looking over the report, and thank you everyone for your questions. It definitely will be nice to continue to hear how that has come out, and the continuing work that you're going to be doing. So obviously there's the emails if anybody has any other questions on that. And we have another presentation about the parking study in Lamont. And oops, who was going to do that? Oh, Dustin, are you on?
Hi, Sherry.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll just add to, I'm also the project manager on the Incentives Consortium project. So as we get that going, if you all be interested in hearing more about that, we can certainly bring that to this committee to hear about the next steps, because we're going to be focusing on some of that sub-regional conversations, like Matt said. But I'm not here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about the Lamont downtown parking study. Just real briefly, my name is Dustin Cagliari. I'm an assistant planner or associate planner with the local planning department. Next slide. So just real briefly, just going to give a brief overview of the project we're working on in Lamont, some of our key topics and goals, some opportunities that have been presented within the project, and some discussion topics for all of you. Next slide. So Lamont, if you all are not familiar, we're talking about Southwest suburban community right along the I&M Canal, Des Plaines River. You've got access to right off I-55 and I-355. There's a metro station downtown that provides Heritage Corridor service. A fairly prominent suburb in the Chicago area. Next slide. So the plan we're going to be working on is going to be specific to downtown Lamont, and I say we're going to be working on it because it just kicked off last week. So we just kicked things off. We'll be studying parking utilization in the downtown area and the potential for alternative uses like park and civic space. As you may know, downtown Lamont has been really growing in recent years, in both amenities, residents, and visitors. And so there's a need and desire to evaluate the current parking situation and the potential for those sorts of alternative uses in the downtown. This project is being led by it's an LTA project, but it's a consultant-led LTA project. So a team of Sam Schwartz and Tesco Associates is running this one. Next slide. So within the overarching study, we have 4 key topics that we're seeking to advance within this project. They are the highest and best use of right-of-way. So significant portions of downtown Lamont's existing right-of-way is dedicated towards parking, both street and surface parking. So throughout this study, the plan will make recommendations on how to actively manage parking, as well as identify opportunities for uses with the highest economic benefits. Second topic is a safer, more pedestrian-friendly downtown. So the plan will identify near and long-term opportunities to advance safety and pedestrian friendliness through things like streetscaping and placemaking, helping to connect downtown Lamont to nearby destinations, as well as attract visitors from neighboring destinations. Third topic is support for future development. And as I just mentioned, downtown Lamont's seen some significant development interest in the recent years. Notably, there's a fairly large apartment building that's scheduled for delivery in downtown next year. So this plan needs to consider the needs and priorities of both existing but approved, planned, and desired transit-oriented development around the metro station downtown when making said parking recommendations. And then finally, we'll be looking at the adaptive reuse of civic space. And so what I mean by that, the village owns 2 vacant parcels in downtown that are envisioned for public use. Currently one for public parking, one for civic gathering space. And so the plan is going to take a deep look at identifying the highest and best use for each space, taking into account both the long-term vision for the downtown as well as the findings from the parking study. Next slide. As with all of our LTA plans, CMAP is seeking to implement recommendations from to 2050. There are 3 recommendations that will be directly advanced by this plan. So the project will support the development of compact, walkable communities by identifying the highest and best land uses of existing right-of-way. So the plan will support the development of a more compact and walkable downtown in Lamont through new parking guidelines for development, streetscape and placemaking strategies, and transit supportive land uses. The plan will help make transit more competitive by leveraging the metro station as a community asset. So the plan will explore flexible and alternative uses for existing metro parking stalls, many of which, as you can imagine, are sitting unfilled during a time of historically low demand and may not be needed in the same way in the future. So the plan will explore strategies to utilize the commuter rail station and enhance multimodal integration and continuity within the community. And finally, the plan advances the recommendations to target infill, infrastructure, and natural area investments by promoting a vibrant downtown district in a suburban community. The plan will support further investment in opportunity sites for infill development in downtown Lamont through strategies to both actively manage parking, enhance transit connections, and encouraging transit supportive land uses. Next slide. And I just want to make a note of this. So the pandemic has forced many communities to rethink how they utilize their right-of-ways in open space. And, Lamont's no different. Talking to community contacts, spaces that were previously very underutilized in downtown have become some of the liveliest as people have prioritized outdoor spaces where social distancing and free airflow were in greater supply. And business and consumers have adapted, and we're all thinking differently about what should be prioritized. So within this project, it creates some greater openness within the community to livability, walkability, and safety recommendations. when we come to thinking about parking. Next slide. And so with that, it's a brief presentation. I'm happy to take any questions on the project. But I've got some discussion topics on the slide, and I'm happy to kind of expand on those. I've got some more data that might spur some conversation, but I wanted to pause for any questions if they were immediate. So hearing none, I'll kind of walk through this. So thinking about topic 1, walkability in suburbia. We're thinking about residents from within downtown, outside of downtown. There's the I&M Heritage Trail, there's walkers, there's visitors from destinations like the Forge, which is a big outdoor adventure park that recently opened nearby. How do we get people to park once, or use the different means to get downtown in a suburban community? Thinking about number 2, engaging with underrepresented groups in Lamont. So 23% of Lamont households speak a language other than English at home, mostly Slavic languages, like including Polish, Serbian, other Indo-European languages. And additionally, it's a high-income, wealthy community with a median household income of $95,000, but 27% of households make less than $50K a year. So how do we develop strategies that make sure we're representing everyone in the community and not just who maybe we hear from the most? And then finally, thinking about accessibility challenges and opportunities. These conversations around parking, and particularly parking demand and supply and things like that, one concern often is what that does for accessibility for older adults and individuals with disabilities. This is an aging community like many other established suburbs. And so I'd be curious about the committee's thoughts on that topic as well.
This is Lori. I mean, yeah, not only in terms of transportation, but also housing and what kind of housing stock may be changing to accommodate people aging or acquiring disabilities. I think that would also be another issue, it seems, for that community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, this is Raj. And just one thought is, I don't know how much people have thought about even, I just have some familiarity with Lamont just because the Lamont Temple, the Hindu temple, is right up the hill from the river and then the downtown Lamont. And whenever there's a large religious activity at the temple, sometimes they have the parking in Lamont downtown and then have shuttle buses going up to the temple. But are there ways to really think about that sort of bridge between other assets that are in the area that bring quite a bit of people from different areas, and easier for that to also be incorporated into the activities of that downtown? So people are coming to the temple, they're going to spend some time there, they're going to spend, they might be coming from a while, they might want to go somewhere and spend more than a half a day or part of a whole day on a Sunday. Where would they go? I mean, if there was something that made it easy for them to get to downtown Lamont or something attractive, there might be reasons for connections and exchange with a broader group.
Yeah, that's I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a really good thought. And that's a good point too about the overflow parking, possibly, going downtown too. And then, what if we're talking about parking counts and different types of land uses, like what are the runout effects throughout the area, and how can we make, thinking about things like wayfinding and signage and streetscaping and creating a more welcoming environment. So if people are coming into town, are they staying for a bit longer? Absolutely.
Yeah, which also raises a lot of pedestrian issues as well. as it relates to accessibility or in general.
I guess I also think in adding to that is just the for people to feel welcomed in and somehow, whether that's parking, but that it doesn't disturb from sort of the flow and the public space of downtown also. And I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with Lamont, but just, you know, thinking that as you plan it out and engaging with different groups, especially those that live there, to be able to use the downtown area in the best way, which I'm sure you are doing. So just mention that also.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, this is all great.
Are there a lot of the bus lines that go? Do people use the buses back and forth to get to the downtown area?
So that's a good question, and we're not. We're kind of just really the beginning stages here. I don't have a great sense of the mode use of the pace routes out there, but that's a good flag. You know, it's interesting because talking to the community, right? They've had areas that generally they've just like been surface parking, and then with the pandemic, they've kind of overnight been taken over by restaurants and different establishments. And so, and they're realizing how much liveliness is added, right? And there are some of these things that they maybe always consider doing, but within last year and this year, having that space be used for something else has been really revealing. So I think it's going to be a really interesting project, and I'd love to, this has been really helpful to talk through, and I'd love to come back at some point and get your take.
And I would just add too, but look about bicycle use.
Yeah.
Again, you're probably looking at that, but just to make sure there's enough places to park, or that it's friendly, or it's good signage, as we were saying before.
Yeah.
Or safe.
Absolutely. And I think that's something to thinking through some of those connections to destinations nearby, you know, what sort of, because there's a prominent trail that runs right along the canal there. So how do we improve like wayfinding along the trail and bring those people in and give people the option to come to downtown via bicycle?
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think this was great to hear how that comes out. So there's so many things going on. So just keeping us abreast of all of that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks to all of you.
Okay. And next, Raj is going to present on his work. I think you're going to present on your work with the Capricorn, the Chicago Area Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network. And excited to hear about that. I do apologize in advance. I will have to leave in the middle of your presentation, but I will hopefully catch some of it. And thank you, everyone.
Sure. Thank you, Sherry, and thanks for the group and Enrique for the invite today to present a little bit about some of the work that's been going on in the health systems around Chicago, and to look for potential partnerships with other activities that are going not only through our working group, but then also with the broader CMAP initiatives and where we can find things together. So I wanted to, there's multiple projects as a geriatrician working at Rush, and then also co-leading the Center of Community Health Equity that I thought I could have presented. But I wanted to share one around sort of data connections and infrastructures, because there's so much of a need to understand equity in our area. And one of the key outcomes is people's health and their well-being. And I wanted to at least broaden people's perspective about what's been going on in the health perspective to also tie in with, you know, the public health efforts to allow for some of that understanding and potential research. So the Chicago Area Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network, if we could go to the next slide, or Capricorn as we like to call it, is really started as part of a derivative of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. In the Affordable Care Act, almost now, 10, 12 years ago, there was legislation put into play to set up a semi-private entity called PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, that would focus on collecting funds that were essentially $1 per person insured from the health insurers to then provide for research capabilities and understanding issues around patient-centered research, things that would drive more stakeholder engagement of individuals getting care and making sure they had the best available data with their clinicians. So a key feature of that program for PCORI was to build this national network they called PCORNet, or the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network, that encompassed 13 different networks around the country, covering about 70 million lives that were getting care in healthcare systems. And in Chicago, there was no one group that could have gone by themselves. So what happened is about 14 hospitals in 11 health systems came together 6 years ago to put an application for how we could work together in a very hyper-competitive health system space to find collaborative processes. And it's hard to believe, 6 years have gone by and we've sustained this network, and we're looking for funding to be continued for another 3 years. But it brings pretty much, if we go to the next slide, groups that are 14 hospitals, 7 of them academic medical centers. So pretty much every major academic health medical center in the Chicago region is part of this. The Cook County Health Systems is part of this work, and the 2 VA hospitals and University of Illinois Hospital is also part of this network. We have over 300 primary care practices represented, and 21 federally qualified health centers, and 8 specialty children facilities. And overall, because of the way the region is, and in northern Illinois, about 10 million patients are covered by these 14 hospitals and their providers, at least with some touch point for healthcare. We don't cover every hospital in the area, but at least we cover some key mechanisms that can provide us information about what's happening to people as they seek healthcare. And if we go to the next slide, if we think about who gets healthcare, who engages with the systems, what we looked at was sort of the basic demographics of Capricorn, which is shown in the blue on the bars, and then the Chicago census data. And we always knew healthcare systems tend to be a little bit more likely to engage women than men, and then also engaging more older adults in general for their healthcare. But in most aspects, we're about even and compared to the broader Chicago area, because at some level people do access healthcare. What we find sometimes is the data is a little bit trickier, like especially around race and categorization in hospitals. There's still quite a lot of missing data in the hospital records compared to what we get from census data about who's coming, or people categorize themselves slightly differently when they come to their healthcare systems. But we do represent, we're one snapshot to represent sort of what's happening with people in the Chicago region and getting care at these institutions. And we go to the next slide. And what the entire idea of PCORNet and for Capricorn was every health system uses a slightly different way in the transformation to the electronic health record for organizing their information. But what we wanted to do is build a common data model underneath it so that we could understand and answer questions like how many people have diabetes in our region by querying our healthcare systems and having the same way to find that information in each of our healthcare records. And so that's sitting in the background in a research platform that's IRB approved by a common IRB between all of these institutions called ShareB, and with the governance model and data use agreement models that sort of protect how the data is used, and for research purposes, and then how do we also understand and guard the safety and privacy of this information. So if we go to the next slide, what we collect, or what we have some background information in this underlying data model, are things such as, the demographics of who comes to the healthcare systems. What are some of the diagnoses that people present with? What are their vital signs, things like their blood pressure? What are some of their procedures that they come for the hospital? What are some of the medications they're prescribed, and some of the lab results? And then we also are working on continuing to improve the model to understand things like immunization rates for things such as the COVID vaccine, so that we can understand the broader uptake of immunization campaigns for public health purposes. We're also trying to work on, as more people are understanding the social determinants of health and health systems are implementing measures of this, how do we capture some of the socioeconomic status indicators that also influence health? We go to the next slide. And this is just a detailed diagram of some of the different variables and the different tables that are part of this data set. That's everybody organizes their data to, and some of the key variables. But it gives us a better sense of understanding how we can use a similar code and a mechanism of finding information across multiple systems to help answer questions. And if we go to the next slide. And then we have the potential to connect with broader data sets, whether it be the US Census data, whether it be geospatial data, other cohorts that have been part of research studies, not only regionally, administrative data coming from Medicare, death index data. So there's ways now that you have the common data model to then also reflect and collect and engage with information that's collected in different areas that are not natural or necessarily part of sort of people's healthcare and how their records are organized. And then we go to the next slide. And I wanted to give an example just of what we've been able to do. And these are not easy to pull off, but just to give you a flavor of what is possible. So about 5 years ago, we brought together health system leaders across our institutions to talk about what would be a demonstration project for how this Capricorn data could be combined with community needs to improve health equity and understanding. So one of the areas that we looked at that was of interest to hospital leaders is to really understand homelessness and how the hospital systems could work on improving identification of individuals that were homeless coming to their care, and then also what were the reasons people were coming in, and then some of their outcomes. We don't always capture well in healthcare systems if somebody is homeless. There are codes for it that are recognized nationally, and we use some of them, but it's not in a consistent manner. So we actually partnered based on that idea with All Chicago and their sort of homeless management information systems, where they've been, as they've worked with clients from a social service point of view for homelessness, have a data set that they've been able to manage. Now, the goal of this for everybody's trust and protection was not to feel like that data set was being combined or shared, but that they were kept separate, but there was ways that you could de-identify individuals, give them a unique code, and see if that code existed in another data set, and then combine data across. So we looked at the data over a period of time between who was in the list for HMIS and had clinical data from our Capricorn model. We looked at people identified with homelessness in the Capricorn data model, and then we looked for the overlap, and we found 3 groups. We found a lot of people were in the HMIS system that weren't being flagged in our health system as being homeless. We found in our Capricorn model some people that we flagged as homeless that weren't getting services from social care and homeless groups. And then we found a group where they were in both systems. And we just recently, after a couple of years of this proof of concept and getting these data sets to link and understanding some patterns about, well, what are individuals in these different groups seeking care about and their needs when they come to an emergency room, or they Comfort Healthcare. And it's not necessarily that we were surprised by some of the results, like behavioral health was a common reason people were coming in for care. But we were, it was interesting to find out a common reason why they were coming to the emergency department was for prescription refills. Something you could have thought that, you know, individuals should be getting with a primary care doctor on an outpatient side rather than having to come to the ED visits. So this article is approved and is going to be published in the next month or so in the Journal of the American Public Health Association to show that we can connect models from different groups and understand a little bit more about how these two worlds connect, and we can learn about information. The All Chicago group and the homelessness group really valued this project. It gave them more information about what was happening in their care, and also a recognition that we were missing many opportunities in the healthcare system to connect people to social services around homelessness. So that's an example. And then if we can go to the next slide. We go into sort of the ideas that in Chicago, especially because of the way our region is structured with multiple health systems, we also have a fragmented healthcare system. So not everybody sticks to their own one healthcare system. They tend to go between multiple healthcare systems. So if you ask a question like how many people have diabetes, looking at the healthcare record, you could actually overcount, because that person with diabetes could be recorded at Northwestern, could be recorded at Rush, could be recorded at University of Chicago. And if you just queried each database, you would actually get an overcount. But because we have some of this deduplication technologies, we're able to prove that or kind of probabilistically show that that person might be the same person who's getting care at multiple sites, and be able to understand some of that defragmentation and coordination of care with privacy protections that are incorporated in it. And if we go to the next slide. And so we do have a process of engagement, and that's why I wanted to bring it up to this group so that it could be shared, where we want to work with community organizations, with people looking at innovative questions, thinking about ways to engage with health systems. It's not only for the growth of our researchers and our academic individuals here and around the country, but it's also understanding some of these broader activities. So we have a process that goes from putting in a request for how to work with Capricorn. We have a steering committee that looks at these items and comes to agreement about whether we should support these efforts. That steering committee includes a patient and community advisory board as part of the steering committee, so the community's feedback is incorporated into all of this decision making on how data is used. We have an IRB approval process so that there are the human subjects protections put into play. Then we have work to develop with data science. How do we measure these things with the data we have? And then we can validate that query with a couple of sites and eventually run it across all of our network with the 10 million individuals. And then have a process with a group called Mariah, so that there could be some honest broker data aggregation where people don't get identified or health systems don't get identified, and then be able to transfer that information and output to researchers and community members so that we can better understand patterns of how healthcare ties in with social services to improve health equity over time. And we've been iterating on this process over the last 6 years, trying to get better. We're still learning, but we're getting the governance and the structures in place to make this happen. If we go to the next slide. And then what is really nice is if you can actually figure it out at one health system and then across Capricorn, that same code can then be passed on to all the other networks around the country, and you can see the patterns around the national networks. This map just shows the multiple different national networks that are part of the broader PCORnet. So it saves a lot of time to scale and to move things and ideas and to understand concepts, not only at a local level and a regional level, but then also a national level. We go to the next slide. And just to give a little example of some of the data like we can look at is when we look at common conditions and some of the breakdown in people that were being seen in primary care and using codes that have been developed, like ICD-9 or ICD-10, we can look at common conditions and then understand how many people in our 9.5 unique participants at that point when we ran this in Capricorn had all these various conditions. And especially for less common conditions, it can help to accelerate and make numbers a little bit larger to see broader patterns. And then you can see the same representation for the 110 million people across the entire PCORnet networks. And then we go to the next slide. And so we have a process of even doing clinical trials using these capabilities. And one of the papers recently just got published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where we randomized 20,000 people where they were followed in their own homes to either that had a history of heart disease and a heart attack, where they could either be randomized to taking 81 milligrams of aspirin or 325 milligrams of aspirin. And we actually found that 81 had no inferiority compared to taking 325. You had a little bit less likelihood of bleeding from taking the lower dose of aspirin if you'd already had a heart attack and still getting some of the benefits. So testing new models of how we can do research more efficiently and generate data more quickly has also been incorporated in the model. If we go to the next slide. And our IRB process is really straightforward for a lot of things because it's a combined IRB, so you don't have to go through 10 institutions and work with each IRB separately. And when it comes to things that don't involve PHI and there's not a consent that's necessary, a non-human subject determination can happen in less than a day. And then if it goes in different levels to PHI with consent, it could take about 21 days. So these timeframes for review and regulatory review are quite astounding by sharing responsibilities and building this commons across the Chicago area. If you go to the next slide. And so we have this patient community advisory committee that has over 20 individuals and meets separately, and then also as part of the leadership team for organizing our local Capricorn network. They act as liaisons. They've done their own research, including getting funds nationally through the Eugene Washington PCORI Engagement Award. What they looked at is following up from the Healthy Chicago 2025 data. And in key priorities, and they went out and they did interviews with health and medicine in Chicago with their support and surveys of community members, and isolated that a lot of the community wanted to know more about the impacts of 3 conditions in their communities, and that was cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And that's led to some more at least with that framework, we're looking for the investigators to work together with community partners as citizen scientists so we can understand what we find based on this rich data set that's been organized and collected and protected. And then we go to the next slide. And so we've worked with various collaborators, in very structured manners, including professional associations, and not-for-profit groups. And so we're always looking for ways to partner in situations where it can be of mutual benefit to our communities. And if we go to the next slide. And we've just been increasing the numbers of queries that have been going through our system and getting more efficient at the turnaround times. For simple counts, queries, or tables, it's getting to be really streamlined as we move forward. And then if we go to the next slide. Why would there be benefit in maybe thinking about Capricorn or looking at Capricorn as a resource for CMAP and for the work of sort of the health equity work and this community that this group that we are part of, is that there is quite a rich data set and a representation of people living in the Chicago area and region. We've tried to reduce the cost and complexity of working together so we can be more efficient in getting out information to our communities that can be more meaningful and how they engage. And then we built in the leadership of patient engagement and community so that we're connected with their voice as leading some of these efforts. And my final slide that I have here is just information about how to contact us. We have the website, Capricorn CDRN, and then Twitter and emails to share ideas. And we do have an intake form if people already have an idea developed, where they can put that idea in and then get feedback on it, and we can work to see where the connections are. So I wanted to stop there and then see if people had any questions or comments. I think, Joan, you mentioned about getting a copy of the published article. And so, yeah, once it's released, I'll get that to Enrique to share with the group. I don't think it's come out in press yet, but once it does, we'll definitely get that out about the homelessness work. So any questions or things I could answer at this point about this effort? I would say I was curious, like even just listening to some of the prior presentations, like even the work on the incentivization in some of these big areas that have been very industrial, like McCook, and it makes me wonder, like, if we could actually figure out what happens to people that are within that region or around that region as far as their health outcomes based on those incentive plans. So there's, unique ways you can think about combining with other people that have been presenting or individuals in this group that we could work on. And we just leave it open, and you can always contact me if you have questions, or this other information's available too. I'll turn it back to Enrique then. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions. Yeah, once you get those links, if you can send them to me, we can include them in the minutes so that folks can check out the articles. So, all right. So up next, we have the public comment portion of the committee meeting. And normally this is the opportunity for members of the audience to offer verbal comments or committee. And also, since we are virtually, we took in comments via email, but I did not receive any, so I'm not seeing any comments. So I think we can move on to announcements. If there's any agency announcements, if I may go first and then open it up to anyone else that may have announcements as well. I would like to remind folks that the Future Leaders in Planning FLIP program is currently open for applications. I'm not sure if everyone remembers, but we do the FLIP program every year. It's a youth leadership program for high school students. I know last year they opened it up to college students as well. But this year, the application is going to be open through June 18th. And it's limited to 40 students this year. So let us know if you have any other questions, and I can put you in contact with the person who is running it this year, and hopefully we can get some students across the region to apply. We've had a great number of students around the whole region apply to the program in the past. So. Any other announcements that need to be shared or would like to be shared? So it looks like our next meeting will be Tuesday, August 10th, 2021 at 10 a.m. And at this point, I'm actually looking for a motion for adjourning the meeting. So if someone would,
So
Lori,
moved. Yep.
And then can I get a second? I just need
People want to stay.
if I can get one more person a second. Joan.
Second, Enrique.
Jackie, second.
Awesome. Thank you. There we go. Then we are good to go. Thank you very much. And stay tuned for the minutes. And I will also post the PowerPoint with all the slides from all of our presenters today. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.